Hi, I'm Nicholas Floyd, the author of 7 Nights with Ayahuasca, and this is the third video in my series regarding some advice before doing an ayahuasca retreat. In this video, I'll be talking about dosages and the primary physical effects of the intoxication. The retreat that I went to had all first-time participants start with a small cup, which was about 1 shot's worth or about 50 milliliters or so, and from there on we were able to choose our own dosages on the subsequent nights. For me, even the small cup was relatively intense, but it still felt within the boundaries of what I'm capable of handling, so on the next night I stepped it up to the medium cup, which is about twice the size. And that felt a lot more intense, but it still fell within the boundaries of what I could handle. So on the third night, I stepped it up again to the large cup, which is about triple the size of the small cup, so about 150 milliliters. And that's where I feel like I crossed the point of diminishing return, because I didn't necessarily feel an increase in any of the desirable effects. I only felt an increase in physical discomfort. So on the remaining nights, I scaled back to the medium cup and I just kind of cruised on that for the rest of the ceremonies because that was more or less my sweet spot. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should just default to a medium dose. For one thing, the strength of the brew can vary from place to place, and it can even vary from night to night at the same retreat. So even though I found my sweet spot at the medium cup, some other participants were gulping down 2 large cups every night, which was essentially triple the amount that I was drinking, and other participants were only having 1 small cup per night, which was only about half the amount that I was drinking. So it just depends on your individual tolerance and how deep you want to plunge. As I mentioned briefly in the first video, one of the common effects is physical incapacitation, and for me that was a mixture of insurmountable fatigue and a gross loss of coordination. So for the majority of the ceremonies I was completely incapacitated to the point where I couldn't even sit up. Even after the ceremonies were over, so this is 4 hours after we initially drank, it was still a struggle for me even just to stand up and walk back to my hut without toppling over. This wasn't necessarily true for everybody. For example, after each ceremony there were at least a couple people who just popped right up and walked out the hut without any issues. But aside from those folks, generally speaking, there was a lot of stumbling and a lot of clomping, so I think it's safe to say that most people were at least a little bit discombobulated. Throughout the intoxication, my body temperature varied quite a bit and rather quickly as well. So for example, in the short span of maybe 30 minutes, I might go from feeling chilly to suddenly feeling hot, and then the next thing I know I'm feeling chilly again. So for that reason I would recommend dressing lightly, but also have with you a hoodie or a blanket or something that you can easily put on and take off as needed. If you're even moderately familiar with ayahuasca, you've probably heard about the violent vomiting that goes along with it, and from what I had read before I went down to the Amazon, I was under the assumption that everyone who drinks ayahuasca will be violently vomiting. But that turned out not to be the case at all. So when I got down to the Amazon and we were drinking ayahuasca, it was during nighttime and it was pitch black, so I couldn't see anything, but each person who was vomiting kind of had their own unique gurgling noises, and so judging from that, I would say that out of the 20 or so people who were with me at the time, maybe only 4 or 5 were actually vomiting on any given night. And I talked to a staff member outside of the ceremonies, and she had drank ayahuasca dozens of times, and she said that she had only vomited once, or maybe it was twice, I can't recall, but her number was very close to 0. Now I have a hypothesis about why only certain people vomit, but that's actually more relevant in the next video, so I'll talk about it there. For now, suffice it to say that just because you drink ayahuasca doesn't mean that you will definitely be vomiting. Just be aware that there's a very real possibility that you will barf violently. Intense cramping is another potential side effect, and one that I experienced personally throughout my 7 nights with ayahuasca. It felt like a sharp bloating pain snaking all the way through my intestines, and when it finally reached my rectum, I had to clench with all of my might to prevent crapping my pants. And you might be thinking, well, why didn't you just go to the bathroom? And the answer to that is twofold. First of all, I feel like that would have really pulled me out of the ayahuasca experience, and it would have been time wasted that I could have spent immersed in the visions. And second of all, recall, if you will, that physically I was out of commission, so I couldn't have stood up even if I wanted to. Being that I didn't really have a choice in the matter, I simply clenched up and weathered the storm. Now, surprisingly, when I finally did stumble to a toilet after the ceremonies, On the first couple of nights, I managed to lay some solid bowel movements, but after that it went downhill quickly and it wasn't pretty. So be aware that some intense cramping and some equally intense diarrhea is a potential side effect. And if your experience is anything like mine, then you will probably spend a lot of time sitting on the toilet, weeping a symphony of sorrow out of your rear end. During the intoxication, my senses were not only heightened, but also a bit out of whack as well. So for example, with my sense of hearing, everything sounded very loud and very close, but I couldn't quite pinpoint where the sounds were coming from. Depending on the type of sound, it could have been very pleasant, as was the case with the songs of the male shamans, or it could have been very unpleasant, as was the case with various other sounds throughout the ceremonies. My sense of vision was heightened in that I was very sensitive to light. So for example, if somebody got up to go to the bathroom and he didn't properly shield his flashlight, having that shined in my direction even just a little bit could be painfully bright. My sense of touch was also heightened, so if I grazed my fingertips across my arm or just gave myself a hug, it felt pretty amazing. I would assume that my sense of taste was also heightened, but I didn't actually eat or drink anything throughout the ceremonies, so I can't say for sure. And my sense of smell was also heightened, so the aromas of the jungle, the smell of the rain, things like that were very intense but very pleasant. Now, after the ceremonies, the smell of my diarrhea was also very intense, but that was not so pleasant. So generally speaking, all of my sensory input was significantly heightened, for better or for worse. Lastly, I also felt a strong sense of dissociation, which technically speaking is probably more a psychological effect than a physical effect, but I mention it here because it has to do with one's relationship to the physical body. So by dissociation, I mean I felt disconnected and separate from my physical body. And if you've never had a dissociative experience before, the best way I can explain it is if you've ever had local anesthetic, or if you just sat on your foot for too long and it fell asleep, then you probably know the feeling of touching your own body and having it feel foreign, like it doesn't belong to you. And essentially it was that same feeling but on a grand scale, so my entire body felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me. And initially it was very disorienting and a bit scary as well, but like every other effect, I found it best to just embrace it and ride it out. So that's the gist of it. Of course, there are some other effects that you may feel, such as tingling or jittery vision or things like that. This is not supposed to be a comprehensive list, but generally speaking, these are some of the things you could expect. Now, of course, people don't usually drink ayahuasca for the physical effects, but rather for the psychological effects, and that's what I'll be discussing in the next video, so stick around.